researcher, feminist, and LGBT activist. So, how
Yeah.
did this journey begin?
So, see, I've been part of the women's movement in India for, I don't know, maybe like 30 years or so, yeah. And, but in terms of issues of sexuality and LGBTQ issues, maybe for the last, I'd say 15 years, I've been involved. And I mean, just to give you a personal kind of a background and context. So, till I was 35 years old, I'm 51 now. So, till I was 35, I thought I was attracted only to men and that, you know, I was heterosexual. And I think it was then that I kind of became part of the community, started getting involved in activism, and yeah, so basically that's where the journey began.
So, you
Yeah.
said you realized you were different when
Yeah.
you were 35.
Yeah.
How difficult was it for you to open up?
Actually, it was difficult and not difficult at the same time. I think because I was 35, because I think I'm quite empowered in many ways, and I think being part of the women's movement, being financially independent, already being familiar with LGBT issues, you know, uh, I was actually part of a group called Friends of Siddharth Gautam that used to organize film festivals on LGBT issues even when I was heterosexual. Okay, so in a sense, I already was supportive of these issues. And so, you know, there was no doubt in my mind that I was doing anything that was, you know, wrong, or I had no guilt, I had no shame, the usual sorts of things that one associates, you know. And and also all my friends were excited for me, were happy for me, uh, and so were my colleagues. I mean, I never had to hide anything from my colleagues. In fact, it became very much part of our conversations at work. And but in terms of the family, it was obviously like a different kind of a story. And I mean, it's not even that everybody knew. And it's not even that I chose to tell. It was, you know, how things kind of get found out also. I think there's also a certain amount of protectiveness. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And I think that's part of the difficulty of dealing with this thing with families, you know, because I think that in a South Asian kind of context, so I don't think Bhutan and India would be that different
Yes.
in this respect. That I think that we are the good children, you know, even when
Yes,
when we
yes.
grow up, and we are protective about our parents and we don't want to hurt them, and you know, and so yeah, so that's there. And I think that I think that what's most difficult and what's most hurtful when it comes to families is that, you know, you often love people in your family. Okay, it's not always the same with everyone in the family. You know, we have some complicated
yes,
relationships,
yes.
but then there are people
Yes.
who we do love deeply, and they love us and all that. And then when you see that person that you love, like maybe it's your mother, and you know, and uh, and they care so much for you and your happiness, but about this one thing, you know, it's almost like you can't recognize that person anymore. So like, this is the person who I love, she loves me, but what's going on about this particular issue? And you know, they say that they want your happiness, right?
Right.
And you are happy. So then what is going on? Like, what is the problem, you know?
Yes.
And then you also kind of see contrasts with other relationships, you know, in the family. People who are married, you know, who
Yes,
are
yes.
following the kind of social conventions, who might be miserable in their marriages, you know, they might be really unhappy, you
Yes.
know, but that's not the point. And you are asked, you know, like, why are you in this kind of a relationship? And you know,
Looks like most of the LGBTs, they are vulnerable to this
Yeah.
kind of harassment.
Yeah.
So, what kind of violence are they usually exposed to?
Yeah. You know, it's actually very difficult to answer that question in the sense that it's very different for different section. See, we say LGBTQ, like as if it's like, it's actually very different situations. It depends on your gender. Yeah, it depends on your class. It depends on whether you're living in a big city or a village or a small town. So it's difficult to actually generalize. But I just want to say that if I kind of think of, say, a journey of someone, like right from childhood, I think there are some general kind of issues that come up. So, say if I'm a child, and either in terms of my gender, that I don't identify with the body that I was born in, or in terms of my sexuality, if I'm attracted to the same sex, it's very likely that I will grow up thinking that I am the only one in the world like this, that there is nobody else like me. This is very common. I mean, I like I said, I'm a late bloomer, so I only kind of came into this at the age of 35, but many of my other friends who've kind of known about their gender or their desires when they were much younger, everybody has felt like this, So can you imagine, like we talk about alienation, no? We talk about alienation from the self. We talk about loneliness, thinking like, am I a freak, So imagine children having to go through that. So I think the violations begin from there, from childhood. Then you go to school, what do you read in textbooks? There is only one kind of family, father, mother, children, at most there will be joint family. I mean, in India, like you have some grandparents. But, that's the only kind of representation. You don't find a reflection of yourself in the textbooks. So I think it is extremely, extremely difficult. And clearly it happens because society, just wants us to be in two boxes, either you have to be a masculine man, macho man, or you have to be a feminine woman. And people feel very threatened by anything that's outside of these two boxes, and then you're punished in so many ways. But if I can just come back to what I was saying, the violations that people face through the course of their lives. So, childhood, like, am I the only one like that? School, no representation of who you are, people making fun of you, bullying you, all that. Then I think that, even things that we take for granted often, you go to a doctor, you go to a doctor. Now, to a doctor, you have to tell, what your symptoms are. So if you're an LGBTQ person, like a lot of the times, especially if there are things to do with sex or reproduction or, the things, the gynecological things or, or whatever, sexually transmitted diseases, you have to censor yourself, no? You cannot actually give the doctor the full information that she or he needs. So how are you going to get the treatment that you need and deserve? There's kind of there's self-censorship also because you're scared. You don't want the doctor to kind of turn around and judge you for your desires.
You are the founder member of Nirantar. Can you tell us about your NGO?
So Nirantar has been working for over 20 years in the area of gender and education, and working a lot with rural women and education, including focus on women's rights. So not just formal education and not just reading and writing, although that's also part of it. And we've also been working on issues of sexuality, and we've been working with community level groups that work in rural areas. And we've been, talking about sexuality and why that is such an important issue. Not only sexual violence, but also to see how is sexuality really important in women's lives. Yeah. So, and all the kind of rules that society places on us, and tries to control us. So, then things that everybody is familiar with, it's like, so how much space is there for a woman to express her own desires? How much does her desire get controlled by or limited by what her husband wants? Is she able to express herself? Is she able to initiate? Is she able to say no to what she doesn't want? Then this whole thing of blaming the women. if say there's sexual harassment, or she's a slut, or she dressed like this, or she asked for it, all these things are issues about sexuality. And then we hear these things, and sometimes it also gets internalized as shame, and we know how harmful shame is. If we feel shame, on a bus, even if somebody is sexually harassing you, you can't turn around and say, what are you doing to me? Because you feel shame. You don't want to draw that kind of attention to your body and to yourself, Somewhere you also become sexualized in that thing. So basically we try to talk about, and also things like domestic violence, that we did an activity with, people who've been working on domestic violence for many, many years, they've been handling cases. And every time we did this exercise, that, okay, write down all the cases of domestic violence that you've been handling, all the types of, and what is the reason behind the domestic violence. You will not believe it. I would say that in 90% of the cases, we found that sexuality was behind the domestic violence, okay? And still we don't talk about it. So mostly domestic violence happened because the husband suspected that, she is having an affair with somebody else, or maybe he is involved with somebody else, or he thinks she's too attractive, or somewhere or the other, sexuality plays a role, or their desires don't match, what he wants, she doesn't want, whatever, that kind of thing. So it's so important to talk about sexuality for women's organizations. Of course, it's not just about women. Men also suffer. Men also experience so much, like pressure. They have to be masculine. They have to kind of, there's also this thing of performance, And so what we do is that we don't talk only about LGBT, We talk about LGBT because it's a larger issue, Because sexuality is a larger issue, and anybody who doesn't want rights to be violated in the name of sexuality will also need to recognize LGBT rights, as part of that larger concern with sexuality.
Yeah. There is a general notion that LGBT is an urban phenomenon. So how much water does it hold?
None at all. So like I was saying, Nirantar, for example, works almost entirely in rural areas in India. And so, in every village that, people kind of refer to in our kind of trainings and workshops and all that, there's always instances of two men living together, two women living together, or people had heard from, of such people in another village. And, it doesn't come as a surprise, because the fact is that there has been a diversity of desires ever since time immemorial, right?
Yes.
And so it's not a modern phenomenon, it's not a Western phenomenon, that's what people like to say, that's again because they are threatened by these kinds of desires. So anything you don't like, it's so easy to say, oh, Western, oh, bad, it's come from outside, it's never existed here. If you want evidence also, it's there, it's in temple carvings and all of that. So obviously it's something that's been there forever. It's something that's there everywhere. So it's just that people sometimes like to believe that it's a
urban phenomenon.
Urban, westernized.
Yes, actually I spent like almost 2 years in Bangkok. So when I first visited Bangkok, I was quite surprised to see a transgender.
Yeah.
And then, but I think as you like stay there for a longer time, you see them every day, you get used to.
Yeah.
So how important is it for the society as a whole, friends and family, to support them, to let them be themselves?
Yeah. I mean, it's hugely, hugely important, it's so important. And I think it's also the kind of stage, I don't know much about the Bhutan situation, but my sense is that here, the LGBT thing, it's just, like when water boils,
Yes.
those bubbles kind of rising, But it's very, very important, that especially at a time when things are underground, and it takes so much courage to kind of really openly start talking about these issues. I think the role that friends and family and other activists can play is so, so, so important, I mean, I remember that when we used to have press conferences, suppose there was a case that happened. Today it's different. Today, like, we sit and, we talk to journalists and like, I'm sitting here like, talking to you. But there was an earlier time when we had to ask friends you know, who are activists. Like you speak, you know, you, because we can't come in front of the camera, you speak and you represent the issues, you know. Or like I was giving you the example of the film festivals that we used to organize in Delhi, you know. This was in memory of my friend Siddharth Gautam, who was one of the first gay rights activists in the country, and he died of cancer. And you know, so in his memory, we used to organize film festivals around his birthday in January every year. And so most of the people who organized the film festival in that committee were heterosexual people, that time including me. You know, and most of the people who came for the screenings were also non-LGBT. You know, so I think the more we kind of not get into this, oh, LGBT, not LGBT, and like if all of us can see it as an important issue, as an issue of rights and dignity, and you know, and to really help at a time when it's difficult for people to speak, you know, for themselves. Yeah.
So how important is it for the society, I mean, social media and the mainstream media to support them?
Yeah, I think in India it's been a journey. I think that earlier the media kind of coverage used to be very sensationalist, or they used to turn up at you know, some LGBTQ pride parade, just take some photos, you know, especially of transgender people, and you know, just go off, and no serious kind of reporting, or especially in small towns, or you know, the regional press, you know, for a long time had very negative kind of attitudes towards homosexuality or transgender issues. And now over the years, I think we've also as activists been engaging with the media, and it's changed now, and you actually have some very, very good reporting on LGBT issues.
Historically, what has helped LGBT communities and groups grow stronger?
So I think, like I was saying earlier, I think other activists who are not LGBT activists have had a very important role to play, and friends. And also the work has picked up gradually, you know, and it's not something that had funding. You know, when funding comes in too quickly, that's also often it becomes, it creates its own problems, you know. So it's good that, like, for a long time there was no funding. And so it was a totally community effort, you know. So in the bigger cities, at least, you had, say, women coming together, running helplines. Even I was a volunteer, you know, all volunteer based. Yeah, I used, for some evenings in the week, I used to sit and answer the phone. Those were not the days of mobile phones. Huh? People used to call from their landlines or from phone booths, or you know, because you didn't even have that kind of privacy to talk about these things. So helplines, then this kind of crisis intervention, and the law. Of course, you know, we've also fought the legal battle, because as you know that in India we have Section 377, and it's a Victorian British colonial law which England has removed, but we still have it, you know. And so then we went to court to you know, challenge that law. We got an amazing judgment from the Delhi High Court, and the judges basically said that what matters is not the public morality, but constitutional morality. Okay, beautiful judgment, you know. So actually saying that, you know, because if you, and it's so true, if you look at what is public morality, you know, in India, we would still have sati, you know, we would still have dowry, because if you go by public morality and what the majority thinks, this is what the majority used to think. So it's only when you have progressive individuals and groups, and then the legal process, I mean, that's how change happens, no? So the law can never say that this is what public morality dictates. They have to look at what, you know, the constitution says, or what are the principles that the country wants to uphold, you know. And I mean, in the Bhutan kind of context, you know, this whole focus on happiness, you know, which is amazing. And then, but you know, in the context of like LGBTQ, how does it translate? You know, I mean, if I'm a woman in love with another woman, you know, so what about my happiness? And then what happens when my mother tells me, you know?
I met an individual, actually highly educated, from Singapore. So she was telling me, like, Singapore is such an advanced country. And then she was telling me the family in Singapore, the moment their son turns teenagers, and then the moment the son has first girlfriend, they celebrate. They invite her for dinner, and then they rejoice over the moment, because they feel they're convinced. I mean, it's kind of convincing them that their son is straight. So it's a little funny, but again, I mean, in a country like Singapore, if they think like that, so how much does it take to change people's outlook, attitude towards LGBTQ?
I think there's no shortcut, no? It just takes time. And even when I'm thinking of family and parents and all that, it's not like they're bad people, right? So it's just that they also think the way that, society thinks. They're a part of society. So, these conversations have to, and change does happen, like, I mean, even in the Indian context, I mean, say, I'm telling my story, which is like from 15 years back. Today with my younger friends, it is easier. Things move faster. They are more effective in the way that they are handling their families. Now in the bigger cities in India, you have parent support groups. So you have parents of LGBT people who then talk to other parents of LGBT people, to try and tell them that actually, even we were horrified initially, or we were really upset and all that, and they're sharing their own journeys of acceptance. So I don't think it's like a gloom and doom kind of situation, but yeah, definitely it takes a long time, and I think it's very, very important for all of us to really be honest with ourselves. So okay, so we might say we are modern, we might say we are liberal, we might say we are compassionate. I'm also thinking of the Bhutan kind of context, or that what we value more than anything is happiness, or we are an open-minded society, and we are quite so, and all of which is true or could be true, but how does it translate when it comes to certain sections of society? And I think that what is very important also is that we look at what kind of humor, what kind of jokes do we make, because I think humor is very important. It's because it holds a mirror. It kind of shows you what are people really feeling. I might say anything. I might say, oh yeah, of course, personal choice, freedom. You have your right to do whatever you want and all that. But actually, the real feelings, what's inside you, will come out in a certain smile. It'll come out in a certain joke. So I think it's very important for us, for all of us, like outside the LGBT community, also to kind of watch ourselves. What is it that we are laughing at? What is it that, and why are we laughing? Is it disturbing us? Is it making us nervous, or because it's really not very nice for the other person? I mean, if we talk about violations, that's a serious violation, even though it might seem like a joke. Maybe if you crack a joke like that, maybe even I'll laugh. I'll laugh along with you, because what else will I do? But inside it might make me feel really, really awful.
There is a saying that silence is violence.
Yeah.
So is it important
my God.
for the LGBTQ to come out?
See, it's not so much about, I'm glad you asked that. I don't think it's so much about coming out. See, people don't have to come out, the issue has to come out. Okay? So, there's a big problem in having this pressure on LGBT people, even from other LGBT people, or from friends outside. Oh, you must come out. Oh, you must tell your parents. Why should I have to tell my parents? I mean, do you know what I'll have to face? I mean, I'm telling you that I'm still coming out to my mother. It's not that one day 15 years ago. The journey is still continuing. Okay, so you don't tell me I have to come out. I'll come out if that's what I feel like I should be doing at this point of time. But it's not easy, and is it actually necessary? And why should I be talking about these issues? If you believe in dignity, you believe in compassion, you believe in happiness, you believe in rights, why will you not talk about it? You want the information, you want my experience, I'll tell it to you, So why this whole pressure on certain individuals to be brave and to come out? Maybe I don't want to be brave. Why? I mean, is it my problem? Is it my doing that social attitudes are like that? Is it my fault that my family is reacting like that? And if it's not my fault, then why does the solution have to lie only with me? It is a social responsibility, Somebody's happiness is being snatched away from them. And here, of course, you have the whole really fantastic idea of the gross national
GNH,
happiness, no? Yes. So you're recognizing that happiness is not just a individual thing. You have taken it to a macro level. It's amazing, right? So I'm saying then why expect one individual to be the kind of guardian of their happiness? It's not just that person's problem. It's a much larger social issue, and we are all responsible. Yeah.
So Jaya, thank you very much for your
thank you.
time and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And I hope you have a wonderful time here.
Thanks a lot.